Good afternoon, everyone. We're right on time, which actually in this case means we're 2 minutes late or something like that, but details. So, given that it's already 4, let's jump right into this. Welcome to this 4-piece cafe. This is a pdfToolbox cafe, which is why I am doing it. And we are going to talk, if I can actually get that back to the title slide, we're going to talk about shapes in pdfToolbox. Before I go there, some small amount of housekeeping. This is a cafe, so you can unmute yourself. You should all know this by now. You can unmute yourself and talk to us instead of just typing in the chat window. But there is a chat window, and you can use that as well if you have any questions. This is a probably not so advanced cafe, although I try to put some interesting stuff in there that you might not know, even if you have worked with pdfToolbox and shapes for a little bit. But if you have questions or there are things you wonder about, then please let me know, and we can see if we have enough time to go into that as well. So what I want to do is I have a very short presentation. And then once we're through this, it's literally 2 or 3 slides of actual content. Once we're through that, I'm going to go to pdfToolbox, and I have some sample files that hopefully will make you understand what the possibilities are a little bit, and demonstrate some, like I said, some of the properties in this shapes part that are not always so well understood. So let's get going. I think most of you know me by now. So let's go to the real subject of this thing. We're going to talk about shapes, and if you look in pdfToolbox where to find that, you'll see that it lives under the fix-ups section. So doing things with shapes is typically part of a fix-up, although it doesn't really have to be always, and we'll talk about that. And if you look at the fix-up, you'll see that it is split up into 2 different parts. Tabs, call it whatever you want, but two distinct parts to the configuration. And the first one is creating the shape. So a shape in pdfToolbox is, well, it is a shape. So it's exactly what that word means in English. And the idea is that it lets you define what kind of shape you want to use. And this, you could create this shape from one of the page boxes. So maybe you want to do something over the whole trim box, or maybe you use an art box and you want to do something with that. So you can create something from a page box. If the page box isn't what you like, then you can create your own custom box. Maybe you have an envelope and you want to highlight where this transparent window is going to be. That could be a custom box that you put in a fix-up. You can also look at the file and see what is already in there, and that comes in 2 different shapes. You have the ability to use existing vector elements, and you have the ability to use page content. And I'm not going to go into any details because I am going to show all of this stuff in pdfToolbox, and that's much more interesting. And then there is something, and this I'm not going to show because it's very specialized already, and it is not that very different in application, at least from the other ways that you can use this. But there is also the possibility to create a shape from the print surface. And well, let me say this about this, about it. The print surface is a term that comes from an ISO standard specific to, at the moment, packaging and labeling, and it indicates the live area. So the things that you're actually going to see once they are printed. And for a package, for example, if, let's say, a box, that could be a highly irregular area. Yeah? So when you think about the trim box in PDF, it's always a rectangular area. You're talking about a business card or a brochure or something like that. But in the case of packaging, that can be a very irregularly shaped area. And the term there is that was invented for that is print surface, and that is also usable. And you can do a combination, and we're going to talk a little bit about combinations as well, because it's one of those things that I think are not used all that much and that maybe are not all that well understood either. So the first part of this fix-up is creating shapes. The second part of the fix-up is using those shapes. And you always have to think about this fix-up in those two distinct ways. So first of all, you define what you want to work with. And then the second part is saying, okay, so now that I have the shape that I'm looking for, what do I want to do with it? And you see some of the applications that you have. What we're going to talk about is mostly mostly the first two, but I will touch on point number 3 as well. I'm not going to talk about Sifter in this presentation. So I can use shapes to add vector elements to my file. And that can be really interesting for all kinds of different purposes, whether it is adding an additional layer that will be a varnish, or maybe it's an undercolor white, or a foil that you want to add to particular elements on the file. So add vector elements. And a vector element in PDF can be stroked, it can be filled, or it can be the combination of filled and stroked. And you have these same possibilities in pdfToolbox. You can also use the shape not for painting something, but for clipping against it. Yeah. And I think I also have an example of that. So I've designed something, it includes bleed, but to my customer, I want to show them how this is really going to look, and the bleed is probably going to confuse them. So I want to clip that away and only have the printable area. So that's also something that you can accomplish with shapes. And then the third thing, and this is actually the first thing we're going to do in my demo in a second, is you can use it to set page boxes. Yeah? A very well-known problem. Someone gives you a file that is very big. It is also very wide, and there is some small design element somewhere in the middle. How do you figure out what the minimal size is? How do I set the trim box, for example, just big enough so that it matches the bounding box of the printable elements I have on the page? Well, you can use shapes for that. And then this shapes engine, at least the definition part of shapes can be used in Sifter. In case you have not used Sifter or looked at it, Sifter is a part of the pre-flight engine in pdfToolbox that doesn't only look at one object, but it looks at the relationships between different objects. And so one of the things that you can do is you can define a shape and then ask Sifter whether certain objects come into close proximity of that shape. Use case, you have a label. That label has a die cut line, and you want to make sure that there is no text that comes too close to the die cut line. And so you can define a shape for your die cut and then use Sifter to test all of the text elements and see whether or not they come too close to your die line. Yeah. So that's some of the ways that this can be used. And so that's also the last thing we're going to see about this presentation. And instead, I'm going to go to pdfToolbox. So let me get rid of this. And then I prepared a few files, and we'll start with this one. And I prepared a number of things that I want to show and that we can use to experiment with. Like I said, if you have questions or something is not clear, just interrupt and ask. I will try to do all 11 of these examples more or less independently and explain what's going on here. So the first use of this shapes engine is a little bit of a strange one, because it is not about creating shapes, but it is this application of shapes to set the page boxes of the file. You can see that I have a file here. It does have a trim box and a bleed box. They're probably not entirely correct. So I could say, well, look at what I have in this file and then set the trim box and at least the media box in a way that would work for me. And so how do I do that? Well, I made a number of process plans here to show these things. And this process plan uses a set trim and media box, and then it will remove everything else. And the remove everything else is important because that way the other page boxes will not confuse us. But also you have to be a little bit careful what you do with the crop box sometime to make sure that you see everything and that the file will also look correctly in other tools. So I'm setting the boxes that I'm interested in, and I'm removing the ones that I'm not interested in. And the setting the boxes I can do in different ways. You have a number of different ways that you can set a trim box or a bleed box or a media box in pdfToolbox. And a lot of them have to do with preset sizes. I could say I know that I want an A4, for example, so I'm going to set the trim box to A4, and then I can decide whether I want to scale the content and so on. This is not what I want to do here. I want to do the opposite route here. What I want to do is look at the page content, and that is why this is called set page geometry boxes based on page content. So I actually want to look at what elements do I have in this document, and then set my trim box and my media box based on the content I have in this document. Yeah, and so under the hood, this uses this uses the shape engine. And so I have the ability to say shape of the visible page content, and that will use rendering to figure out which pixels are colored, and then it will look for the bounding box of what it finds. And I can state whether white areas in my drawing, so if I have a vector element that is white, whether that should be taken into account or not. Or I can look at vector paths. Yeah. And importantly, I can also decide whether I want to include the line width or not. And this is here because of die lines or cut contours, whatever you want to call them. Typically, for a cut contour, it is not the width that is important. The width of the cut contour is only there so that we would be able to see it. But what is going to be cut is the center line of the cut contour. And so in that case, I would probably exclude the line width. But so I'm using the rendering part, and I'm using it twice. And each time I'm adding a little bit of space. So 1 millimeter around for the trim box, and then 5 millimeter around for the media box. Remark that this is not the most efficient thing that I could have done. It would have been faster to just set the trim box and then set the media box based on the trim box later. Now I'm actually doing the rendering twice, and I'm kind of hoping that pdfToolbox optimizes it in the background anyway. So what I can do here is run that, run analyze and fix, and then I'll save this on my desktop, and that will give me exactly what I expect. So it figured out where the bounding box of this image was. And then you can see that the trim box is a little bit bigger than that. I asked for 1 millimeter. This is not a very big file. It's only 4 by 5 centimeter, more or less. Yeah. So I have a little bit of extra space around the objects for the trim box. And then I asked for 1 millimeter and 5 millimeter. So I have 4 mil of space around the trim box. So that's the first application. It's a little bit of a special one because there is not much that you get to set up in terms of the shape engine itself, but it is a very useful one to fix trim boxes of labels and things like that. So let's look at using the shapes engine now. And here I have a process plan. There is only one fix-up in there, and that fix-up is using the simplest way the shape engine can be used. And the simplest way means I simply select one of the page boxes. Yeah, you have all 5 of them here. I selected the trim box, and then under apply, I can choose what I want to do with that. And what I want to do is a stroked shape. I want to have that stroked shape in front of the current page content, which means at the top of the file. And I have a whole bunch of parameters that I can fill in. Parameters like the color. So this is going to be 100% cyan. I also want to set it as a spot color. Spot color will be called cut. It will be set to overprint, which is what I would expect for a cut contour. And then everything else I just left to default. I could put it on its own layer if I wanted to. I can actually add dash patterns and things like that. So you can go pretty far in how you configure this. Oh, I also changed the line width to fit what I want. This is probably still very wide for a cut contour in a production flow, but it does help to see what happens here. So when I run this in test mode, if you don't have the habit of using test mode, then you really should. It is fantastic. I'm running this in test mode, and in test mode, I can choose whether I want to see the page boxes or not. So let me just switch that on, and then you can see that I have a trim box, and my shape that was created is a rectangle on top of the trim box, just as I would expect. So this is created in a separation color, in a spot color, and the name of that spot color will be cut. And it tells you here in the results area that it added one object. So that's exactly what happened. So that is cool. I can have a little bit of a change to here. I selected from trim box, and from trim box, that is very simple, but I do have some parameters. I could, for example, choose whether I want to make my shape a little bit smaller than or a little bit bigger than my trim box. And so if I would say -1, I'm asking pdfToolbox to take the shape of the trim box and then shrink that by 1 millimeter in every direction. So I'm going to do that. And then I could also, let me make sure it's all visible here. I can also ask for rounded corners, and I could say, give me a 5 millimeter, it's maybe a lot, 3 millimeter rounded corner. And now if I go back to tests, well, what you can see now is exactly what we expected. I asked for 1 millimeter of spacing when I created my trim box. Now I ask pdfToolbox to make it smaller by 1 millimeter. So I end up with a shape that neatly touches everywhere where I have my image. It's not an image, by the way, it's vector art in this particular case. But for pdfToolbox, it doesn't matter. In this particular case, it just looks at the trim box. So whatever content we have in this file is unimportant. Yeah, you can also see that I got the rounded corners I asked for. So if you're dealing with labels and you want to create a cut contour and you want to make it easy to peel off, and that means that you have a rounded corner in the thing, then you can easily set it up that it does that. So very simple use of the create shapes action, and just to add a shape on top of an existing page box, the trim box in this example. Now, one of the features of the shape engine is that you're not limited to one shape. So I could actually have multiple shapes to build exactly what I want. What do I mean with that? Well, I can, if I look at what I have here, I could say, oh, I want to start with a shape that is on the media box, and then I also want to use a shape that is on the trim box, and then I also want a custom box. We haven't really talked about this custom box, but I said in the beginning, custom box means you get to define what it looks like. And so if I show you what I have here, this custom box in this example is created from the trim box, but I'm saying 10 millimeters inwards. And Callas was very nice in this case to add the direction of the sign here, because I was always wrong when I use this. So when you specify negative numbers, it means shrink the box. When you give positive numbers, it means that you kind of blow it up. Yeah, so it becomes bigger. So I create a custom box, and now, of course, I have 3 of these boxes that are created as part of my shape. And now the question is, how is this going to look like? How are these things put together? And so let me quickly show that you have a filled shape in this case. I'm not creating a stroked vector element. I'm creating a filled vector element. So that is what we are expecting. And if I now run tests, you will see what happens. Yeah. And so my first shape is the media box. My second shape was the trim box. And then the third shape was this custom box that I put on there. And then the question becomes, why is it filled in the center and between the trim and the media box? And is it not filled in the center? I created some kind of a very weird looking donut, if you want. The reason is very simple. These shapes that I define in my fix-up, so the list of shapes that I have here, these things are combined together. Yeah? And so all 3 of them are used to determine whether a point is inside or outside the finally calculated shape. And so how do we know whether something is inside or outside? Well, the rule that pdfToolbox uses, and there are multiple rules that you could use. Illustrator, for example, has different rules. But the rule that pdfToolbox uses is the even odd rule. Yeah? And that means that if I'm outside the shape and I cross one of my shape lines, so the media box in this case, then I'm in, because I have one crossing. If I cross the next one, the trim box, then I'm out, because now my number of crossings is even. So that means this is not part of the shape. If I cross my custom box again, then I'm in again. Yeah. So the fact whether your a particular point is considered to be inside of the shape or outside of the shape is determined by the number of crossings that you have to do to get from, well, basically infinity to that point. And so you count the number of times you cross a defined shape, and that determines whether it's in or out. I can get a preview of this shape, by the way. So if I switch on shapes here at the bottom left and I run test again, you'll see that it now gives me a shape preview, and that shows me exactly the same thing. Yeah, not very useful in this particular case because I can already see the result quite well in the results tab. But in some cases, you will be working with shapes and it will not be so clear what the shape is. If I would be using this to clip, for example, I might be wondering if the calculated shape was completely correct or not. And then this shape preview is a great tool to evaluate that. So let's go back and let me remove the media box from here. So now I only have a shape on the trim box and on the custom box. And now you see what I mean. It has inversed the painting, if you want. Why? Well, if I go to this point the nose of my my mouse here. If I want to know whether this is in or out, I do the same thing. I come from outside and I say, oh, is there a shape? Is there a shape? Yeah, there is a shape at the trim box. So that is one crossing. One crossing is odd, and that means it's filled. And then when I hit my custom box, the number of crossings is now 2, even, so it's not filled. Yeah. So if you want to create shapes that have holes in them, keep in mind that the way to do that could be to combine multiple shapes. And then in order to know whether which part is going to be filled or not, you have to take into account how many crossings of these shapes you have. Okay. So there is one other thing in the shapes engine that you can use to influence what the final result is going to be. And that is, if I go back to an example, I only have one shape in here, the trim box. But you can see that there is a property that says render only inside shape. Yeah, that's the default value. If you create a shapes fix-up, that is by default what you're going to get. And if I run tests, you'll see that it takes the trim box and it colors the trim box, which is consistent with this render only inside shape. So what happens if I say render only outside shape? Well, it does exactly what you would think. It, instead of now painting the inside of a shape, it actually paints the outside of the shape. Yeah. Depending on what you want to do, this again could be very useful. If I want to really color this area for, and this is by itself a useful example, because this could be a safety margin. For example, if I have a book and I want to make sure that there is no text that comes too close to the edges of my book, then I could show something to the end user, and I might want to visualize a safety area. And that is always a margin that goes around the trim box, maybe everywhere in the trim box, maybe different on different sides of the trim box, but I will have some margin inside of the trim box. And then the question is, how do you do that in the easiest way? Well, doing that, you have different ways of doing it. I could have the trim box and then a custom box and then make sure that I combine them correctly. But so I could also just have a custom box and ask pdfToolbox to paint outside of that custom box. Mind you that it is not entirely the same. I could use the trim box and then a custom box and only paint the area in between. And that would be a very nice safety margin. If I only have the custom box and I say outside, it is not going to stop at the trim box. It's going to go to the edge of the file. So it's going to color everything outside of my custom box up until the media box. And that might not be what you're looking for. So you have to be a little bit careful which approach you choose. But this render inside or render outside can be used to influence what kind of painting you're going to get. When you combine this with multiple shapes, then it becomes a little bit tricky. Yeah, and you have to keep in mind what exactly it is that you are asking pdfToolbox to do. There is one other possibility, and that is the suppress rendering. And this is mostly interesting in that case where you have multiple shapes, and perhaps you want to do something where this even odd rule of determining what is inside and outside doesn't work. You have a small shape somewhere in the middle, and you know that that cannot be painted under no circumstance. Well, then you could say suppress rendering inside of that shape. And that tells pdfToolbox that whatever happens, you don't want that the inside of this particular shape to be painted. Yeah. So that's another possibility that you have, and you can also use it in both directions. So either suppress rendering inside or outside. Okay, so let's do something that is slightly more complex. And up to this point, we've looked at rectangular shapes. whether it's a page box or it's a custom box, doesn't matter, it's a rectangular shape. Can we make it more interesting and say that we want to cut out this little mouse, for example? Well, yes, of course we can, or I would not ask the question. So let me open the example. Looks exactly the same. I'm still creating a shape and then applying it. The apply part is very simple. I'm just doing a stroked shape again. But the creation part, you can already see that you have more properties here. And this is because of the create shape mode that is being selected. So depending on the mode that you select here, you're going to get additional properties that you can use. So this time I said tracing page content, including white areas. I can still choose inside or outside. That is not the problem. But now I have a bunch of properties that determine what's going to happen. And I want to show you the effect of a couple of these. But before I do that, I want to just show you what this does. And that should not be a surprise. I have the outline of this mouse. And then I again asked for 1 millimeter of spacing. So I can either shrink or grow what is happening here, just the same as I would normally do that with a rectangular box. It works just as well with an irregular shape. And then I have a stroked element that goes around it. This is a little bit more time consuming for pdfToolbox to do, because what will happen is tracing. So the page is going to be rendered into an image, and that is immediately also the explanation of the first parameter. This whole page is going to be rendered into an image, and then that image is going to be traced. And this is exactly the same type of thing that you, for example, could do in Photoshop if you want to look at a picture and you want to create a path outline for an element. Yeah, so it's the same type of technology. The default here is 1200. If you look in the documentation, you will see that it gives you some hints for all of these parameters, and actually quite good explanations for these parameters. Don't put it too high, because well, rendering takes time, and not just time, it takes memory as well. Yeah, so the higher the resolution here is, the longer it's going to take. You're not going to see that for a file like the one I have here, because this is a sticker. But if you would have a banner, or you have, God forbid, a billboard of several meters wide and high, and you ask pdfToolbox to render that at a very high resolution, then you might be in a little bit of trouble. Yeah, you can definitely bring that down and put some other number in it, and then you might start to see the effect of that. Yeah, so if I render this at only 36 dpi, literally what I'm doing is I'm asking pdfToolbox to create an image that has 36 dots per inch. That's not a lot. Yeah, and you start to see that. Yeah, I get a deformed outline because my rendering resolution in this case was not good enough and not high enough. So you can definitely keep it at the default value. In some cases, it might be nicer to make it a little bit smaller if your files are very big, for example. Or if you know that they are not going to be very irregular and you just want to follow the outline of what happens a little bit. So the second bit is transparency. That is not going to make a difference in my file. This is mostly when you have image content. And so in image content, the question is, what is an actual object? What is an object? Where does this object start? Yeah? If I have something that is almost completely transparent, is it already part of the object or not? And this parameter lets you choose from what point on pixels will be considered as being part of the object. And then the next property is very much in the same playing field, determines when pixels are counted. So the transparency property looks at the transparency of a pixel and determines whether it plays or not. This one says, well, if I have only 2 pixels and I have nothing around it, do you want to take that into account or not? Yeah. And the technical term for that is typically despeckling. If you're well, if you look at scanner software, for example, this is a setting that is very common because you have dirt on the paper that you're scanning, or you have dirt on the scanner itself. You could end up with very small black ticks somewhere on there. And so the question is, can you filter those out somehow? And this setting allows you to do some of that filtering out, despeckling the result. Then the next one is a very interesting one. It's also a very interesting one if you look at the limit. So this can go from 0 and it can go to 1.3334. Yeah, I don't know who came up with that, but if you read the documentation, you will see that this determines the ratio of straight lines versus curves that you have in this shape that is calculated. What does that mean? Well, it means that if I do a 0, I tell the engine that it can only create straight lines. Am I going to see that? Well, not necessarily. So I've done that now, I think. It's set to 0. So if I now say test, that doesn't look too bad. It looks pretty curved to me. What you have to keep in mind is that approximating a curve with straight lines is not very difficult. The only question is, how many straight lines do you have? And you can very easily try that. If you have a circle and you try to approximate that with a square, it's not going to work very well. If you have 6 sides to the figure you use, you're going to be a lot closer, and so on and so on. So the engine still is using only straight lines. It's just using an awful lot of them, and they are probably all very small. So the end result visually is more or less a curve. I can do something else, which is much more interesting. And that would be, instead of putting it to 0, I'm going to put it to 1.3334, so the other end of the scale. And now let me run this again. And we don't see any difference. I'll show you the difference in a second. What am I asking the engine? Well, when I set this to 0, I was asking the engine to only give me straight lines. Now I'm asking the engine to only give me curves. Yeah? For this file, again, that doesn't cause an awful lot of problem because this is a very curvy mouse anyway. Yeah, so no issue. However, what happens if I give it a business card that is very rectangular? Well, now the engine is in trouble because approximating a rectangle, something with straight corners, with curves, is very, very difficult, and actually much more difficult than the opposite problem. So this shows you what the effect is. This is the best approximation that pdfToolbox can make when you tell it that the resulting shape should only use curves. Yeah. So what should you do? Well, probably for this one, you shouldn't touch the default. And the default is 1, and the default tells the underlying engine, you're smart, do whatever you think you have to do. And so in most cases, the engine is smarter than you are, and it will actually do the correct thing. The optimized curves is another thing that you can do. So if I create a curve, I can also ask pdfToolbox to optimize it. Why is that? Well, there are 3 parameters that play together in a way. I have this, the algorithm setting that we saw in the beginning. So do I want straight lines or curves? I have the second here, which is the curve optimization error. And that is the maximum difference I can have between the curve and where the actual pixels are. Yeah. So pdfToolbox will try to fit this contour line to my image, and I'm telling it that the amount of error that I will support is 0.2 pixel. So actually, it should be really close. And then within those limits, I'm asking pdfToolbox to optimize the curve. So instead of creating 2 gazillion elements, it should only create those elements that are really necessary to stick to my maximum optimization error. Why is this important? Well, it's important because the more complex the line is, the more difficult it would be if you feed this to a cutter, for example. That is exactly where you would want to optimize it. Yeah. So these 3 things play together. You can play with them. The defaults are usually very good. So again, in most cases, I would not really touch this. The adjust size option we already saw. This is what causes that gap to exist at 1 millimeter. And I also have something called applies to, and this can also be interesting. I want to create a cut line here. What if I also have registration marks? Well, the cut line that I create shouldn't take the registration marks into account, should it? So how do I make sure that pdfToolbox ignores those? Well, I can do that with the filter, apply to filter. So if I make a pre-flight check that says, consider all objects except objects using separation all as a spot color, then these registration marks will be ignored as pdfToolbox is calculating the shape. So this is also an important setting and probably one that you might find good uses for in real production files. Right? Okay, so I'm going to come back on at least the reduce shape to outer border settings, but I have a different example for that, I believe. Before we go there, and actually no, I think this is the one. Is it the one? No, it's number 10 I was thinking of. Okay, so let's first look at the simple case. You can create shapes from rendering, but that is not always necessary. What if I have a shape or a file like this one, where I have some other very round animal, and in case you're wondering, there are no penguins in this particular series of animals, so I have to do with something else. But in this particular case, I already have a cut contour. So if I now want to do something with a shape, why would I use rendering? Someone probably spent time in Illustrator or something else to create a very nice cut contour for me. So the shapes engine also allows me to say, look at existing vector paths and use those. And then I have some settings again. I can adjust the size. That is a very common one in most of the other modes. And the most important one here is that I can say which vector paths I am interested in. Yeah. So I am not interested in everything. I'm not interested in the actual image. I'm interested in the cut contour. And in this file, there is something that happens to be called dieline. And what I did is I created a pre-flight check that looks for things that are vector objects and that have a spot color name equal to dieline. So this pre-flight check finds the dieline element, and then I'm using that to create my shape. And if I run tests, this is what happens. So I'm adding a filled shape. I am growing it again by 1 millimeter. So it used the die line around it, calculated the shape like that, grew it 1 millimeter, and then added a varnish on top of my file. Okay. I added something else that I typically add when I talk about shapes. So how do I create a circular cut contour? Well, there are actually two ways of doing it, and I'll show you both of the alternatives. The second alternative hasn't existed for all that long. I think it was introduced in PDF Toolbox 12, and it has an advantage, and I want you to at least know that this advantage exists. The first one, the first alternative that I have here uses the shapes engine, and it specifically uses, oh no, it doesn't use the shapes engine. I did it in the other way around. Okay, cool. Is this correct? Yeah, probably. Or I messed up my example, which is also possible. Let me see. Yeah, I think I have now pointing both of them to the same fix up. So hold on, no worries. Do I still have the shapes version of this? No, so we'll build it, no problem. So the first example, the first variant here is create shapes and apply shapes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say I want the trim box. And then what you can do here, and I already talked about this, is I can specify a rounded corner. Yeah. And the trick that you can use, and now I wonder whether it should be the full or the half, but we'll see that the trick that you can use is you can set the rounded corner using a script so that the rounding will just be exactly okay to give me a full circle. Yeah. So if I do this and then I say fill shape, and what do we want? We want sign, and we want it on overprint. Let's see whether I did it right. I did it wrong, obviously. Yeah. So what we probably need here is, that is bad, of course. I prepared it and then I messed it up at the end. So let's see. I think what I need is the half width, and then that means I have to divide by 2. And if that doesn't work, then there is actually an example of that already in a default library, I think. And if not, I can give you the example. And now I think I messed up PDF Toolbox. There we go. So to the people from Callas watching, the problem with these dialogues is still there, in case you were wondering. Yeah, so let me just explain you what the difference is here, because I'm not going to do this again. And I want to show you the alternative, because the alternative is what you should be using. And that is not what I used to say. I used to say that you should be using version 1, which is the shapes engine, that was the easiest way of doing it. But that is no longer the case, actually. So if I get my file back, and I'm also going to open a different file. Yeah. And what I'm going to do is say tests. Yeah, here. So, and you can already see what's going on and why this is better, I think, but you would be able to see it more if I show you this on this file. So you have two alternative approaches. The first one is to use the shapes engine and then use the rounded corners. The disadvantage of the rounded corners is that this works for circles. So it works if your trim box is exactly square, but it does not work if you have something that is a rectangle, like what I have on screen now. Yeah, the rounded corners, you can only set one diameter for the rounded corners. So I can't actually make PDF Toolbox add an ellipse with the shapes engine. If I use this approach, which does not use the shapes engine, but it uses place circle / ellipse, then I can specify independently the horizontal diameter and the vertical diameter of what I'm placing. And so this approach is going to work for a file that is square, but it's also going to work for a file that is a rectangle. Yeah. And on top of that, it's slightly easier to set up. The setup possibilities that you have here are the same as for the shape engine. So I can still say that it should be stroked or filled or both. I can still set the color. I can still do all these other things that are necessary. Yeah. So if you want to add a circle or an ellipse, use this method and not the first one that I conveniently messed up in my example here. So you can also use the shape engine to do clipping. I mentioned that, and it's nice to at least show you an example. And I'm just going to run it here. There are two things that happen in this process plan. The first is that the cut contour present in the file is used to clip everything outside of the cut contour. And then the second action says remove the cut contour itself. Yeah. Whether you want that or not is something else, and you have to look at your production setup to see what it is that you're trying to accomplish. But this gives you, or could give your customer, for example, exactly what they are going to get printed. Everything outside of the cut contour is gone, and the cut contour itself, which probably would confuse them as well, is also gone from the document. This is an example where having an actual preview of the shape could be interesting because it's used for clipping here, so it's not always that easy to see what the actual shape is. But with the shape preview, I get to see what pdfToolbox uses to clip this thing away. Yeah, so that can help me to figure out that I'm doing the right thing. Okay, so almost there. Let's go back to this example. I want to show you one of the somewhat hard to understand or explain sometimes parameters in the shape engine. And that is that if I go back to my shape definition, this is a shape that is defined from vector paths. And it has this setting, reduce shape to outer borders. Remark that this is off right now. And so once I have my shape, I want to add stroked shapes in front of it. Yeah. Okay. So if I run tests, this is what I get. How does this work? Well, my creation works from all the vector objects that have a particular color. The outline of this mouse has very ugly green, blue, gray color, and I have a pre-flight check that detects those. Okay? And so I'm looking for objects that are that particular color and that are stroked. And if you're wondering why these things, the nose and stuff, aren't part of that, these are filled objects, strangely enough. So they are not lines; they are actually small rectangles and things like that. So I get this magenta color on all of the objects that were identified. Now, if I want to cover every element that has that particular color with something, with a varnish, for example, then this could be exactly what I'm looking for. However, if I'm trying to create a cut contour, for example, you can see what trouble I'm going to get in. My mouse is not going to have any eyes, for starters, and I will have some trouble here because the ears will be detached as well. Poor mouse. So how do I fix this? Well, there is a very useful setting in many cases, and actually I think it's the default if I'm not mistaken, but there is a very useful setting that says reduce shape to outer borders. And if you switch that on, and I run test again, yeah, and you can see what the effect is. So in this case, pdfToolbox looks at all of the objects that you have. And if there are objects that, or if there are parts of this detected shape that are inside of other parts, then they are removed. The only thing that is kept is the real outline of the whole object. And of course, if you're creating a cut contour, in many ways, this is exactly what you would be looking for. Yeah. So very small setting in the creation of the shape, as I said, specifically for when you're using the create from vector paths mode, but it can be very useful to understand what it does. Last example of what you can do with shapes. With the Shapes engine, I can outline a page box. We've already seen that. Where was my example at the beginning somewhere? I had the trim box that was outlined. Yeah, and then I also explained that you can grow or shrink that box. However, these settings are global. What do I mean by that? Well, if I have a trim box and I want to have my shape 1 millimeter outside on all sides of the trim box, then that is not a problem. What happens if I want the margins to be different horizontally or vertically? Or maybe the left-hand side of my trim box should have no margin, but the right-hand side should extend by 5 millimeters. So what if I want to do something where the different sides of a trim box require different handling? Well, if I'm using from trim box, I can't really do that. I only have this one setting. It's a little bit the same as the rounded corners. You have one radius for rounded corners, and that's it. And it's used everywhere. I have one margin when I use from trim box or bleed box, and that's it. I can't change it for different sides. The trick that you can apply is you can use custom box. And if I look at the definition of that, a custom box can be defined in two ways. I can say what the offset is from a point of a page box, and then what the width and the height will be. Or, as I'm doing here, I can say I'm going to use a reference box. And in this case, my custom box will start with the same shape as the trim box. And now I can add margins to there. Again, inwards is negative, outwards is positive. So what I'm saying is on the left-hand side, I want 5 millimeter inwards. Let's change it to, and let's say 0. So on the left-hand side, I want it to be the same as the trim box. Bottom and top, I want it to be in by 10 millimeter. And on the right-hand side, I want it to be in by 5 millimeter. Yeah. If I now run tests, this is what I get. So if I visualize the page boxes again, on the left-hand side, I am the same as the trim box. On the right-hand side and bottom and top, I have different margins. So remember that if you use from trim box as the shape creation mode, you will only be able to say, I want to make it smaller or bigger, and with what amount, but the amount will always be applied to all of the different edges. In the case, for example, of a safety margin, that could be annoying, yeah, because, well, depending on what you're doing, just the safety margin may be asymmetrical. And so remember that the workaround for that is to not use from trim box, but to use from custom box. And because you can define a custom box with a reference page box, you can still start from the trim box, but now I have different edges that I can set. I still have the limitation for the rounded corners, however. That is still one radius value that is going to be used for all 4 of the corners. So you cannot use this trick to also work around that problem. Okay, so this is what I wanted to share. I think we're just about 1 hour, so that is great. Let me summarize, and meantime, if someone has questions, unmute yourself or put something in the chat window. We just summarize. You have this shapes capability in pdfToolbox. It is great to add additional layers, typically spot color layers in the file, but it can also be great to add things like marks, to add lines, to add a whole range of things that you may want to add to a file. It's not as versatile for that as place content is, which is another great technology engine that you have in the product, but it can still do quite a lot. And you can create these shapes from different things, whether it's a page box or looking at the file, doing rendering, or looking at vector art. And then you can decide how you use the shape, and how you use it is either adding elements, it is clipping, it could be to set a page box, it could be as part of the Sifter pre-flight engine. But all of that can be set up relatively easily. One question, so is it possible to share the examples? Yes, of course it is. I'm sure Sam will remind me. Once the recording of this is edited, it will be uploaded, and normally you get an email with the link to the recording. I'll try to remember to also put the examples in here so that you can play with those as well. And then I don't think there are any other questions, which is great. I hope that that this was clear, and perhaps that you've been able to follow along. If not, play with this engine. It is really, really useful, whether you are in a large format or packaging or label or commercial print. I think we have seen examples that would apply to any of those market segments. So try out the functionality. And if there is something that you would like to do and you can't, share that with us as well. Send us an email, tell us what you want to accomplish, maybe with some example files, and we'll be happy to look at that. If it's possible to do it, then we'll tell you how, or we'll give you a pointer in the right direction. If it's not possible, then, well, we can share it with Callas and see if this could become a feature request. Cool, that was it for me. Thank you very much for joining, again, for many of you. And I am sure I will see a lot of you in a future cafe. Have a great day.